Well, good afternoon, lay missioners. I trust you're doing well. I'm going to start I think, my third lecture on Anglican history. Uh, it's kind of difficult presenting Anglican history because it's such a broad sweep of information. Uh, I presented to you in our first year of training the background of general church history, and I'm sort of overlaying that general history with a focus upon Anglicanism and Anglican church history. But there's so much detail regarding all of the politics, the political, the national developments that are taking place in English history during this time period. And to a certain extent, trying to give a sense of what's happening politically as well as religiously is sometimes a challenge. And so I feel like I'm going to give you information overload and information dump. And so to a certain extent, I just want to emphasize a couple of general things as we begin. Periodization is somewhat difficult. I'm defining periods that have a mixture of both political and religious significance. The time period that we're discussing in the medieval period right now is beginning in 670, which is approximately the time of the Synod of Whitby, which brought the English church under the control somewhat of the church at Rome. And then going all the way through 1340, which is approximately the beginning of the Hundred Years' War, which is a time period of struggle between England and France. And it's a struggle among the kings, it's a control of these regions, who has authority, and all those types of issues, but it also has impact upon the church. And so our subdivisions that we have here are a little bit artificial, but what I want to highlight as we just move through, what are some of the significant historical developments for the church? I want you to hear, to a large extent, how important monasticism is in the development of Christianity in Great Britain. Obviously, going all the way back to the Celtic times, but all the different monastic movements, and they're all impacting Great Britain as much as they were the continent. I want you to hear topics of church-state conflict, where there's a struggle of control between the church and the state, and sometimes this involves the papacy, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's just within the region of England itself, where archbishops and kings are struggling for who's controlling which. And sometimes this involves money, sometimes it involves appointments of officials. It has a lot of varieties of expressions, but this is a constant feature of that. There's also a thread of struggle of English independence, independence from the continent itself, with other powers there having influence over Great Britain, but also of the Bishop of Rome, particularly the Pope, having some type of influence over the church in Great Britain. And sometimes that again involves money, sometimes it involves power, sometimes again it involves appointments. And so we'll talk a little bit about a topic called the investiture controversy today. And the investiture controversy is a controversy over who has the authority to invest a bishop or an archbishop with their particular authority to rule and govern their region of the church. And the Pope always wanted someone who was loyal to him, and the king always wants someone loyal to him. And so they both are demanding this type of privilege. And so it brings them into conflict, particularly if the Pope appoints somebody who the king does not want, and or vice versa. And so we have these type struggles. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the notes for you. I'm going to place these on the Scholar LMS so you have access to them. I hope you don't feel this as an information dump. It's more so, who are some of the key players? What are some of the key events that took place in this period from about, really actually this time we're going to be looking about the year 800 all the way through to the 1300. So about a 500-year period we're going to be covering today. This is all part of the medieval period. Medieval period is typically divided into early, middle, and later period. And we're really, I think, moving into perhaps the middle period here as we are dealing with the medieval era. One of the important notes I want you to note here at the beginning of the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th century, is that the Vikings began to invade the regions of all over Europe, but especially England during this time period. And they were very effective in their conquests of land. And what's interesting here is, as your notes indicate, you sort of had this succession of dominant people in Great Britain over a period of time. The Celts are the earliest, then the Anglo-Saxons came in and conquered Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, Germanic tribes coming in, conquering the Celts. And then you have the Vikings coming in, conquering some of those Germanic tribes. And then ultimately you have the Norman conquest, which we'll see today, which is from France. And so you've got successions and waves of conquering. And as the 9th century begins, the Vikings are becoming more intense in their invasions. They're also becoming much more systematic, and they're focused more upon conquest than just marauding, uh, uh, taking plunder or whatever in their earlier methodology. But now they're conquering and they're actually settling. And so with it, a lot of the English monasteries were devastated. They were robbed and some destroyed. Much of Christianity became very contracted. In Ireland, Christianity nearly was wiped out. And so one by one, all of the English kingdoms succumbed to the Vikings, except for Wessex, Sussex, and Wessex for short, West Saxons, and the last stronghold of Christendom in England. And it hangs on. And from there, with Alfred the Great, we have a restoration of Christianity and restoration of control over the region. So that gives just a little feel for what's going on in this period, how it starts off. And so let me just highlight to you some of the key individuals as we move into our study for today. Ansgar is an Englishman. He launches a mission to Denmark. By and large, there have already been some missionaries going to the regions of Germany and other places in Northern Europe. What Ansgar does, he has a relatively successful campaign, but Scandinavia isn't effectively Christianized in this era, somewhat due to Charlemagne. Charlemagne was very coercive in some of his methods, and I think it embittered people towards Christianity. And in places where Christianity was able to take a hold, sometimes it was rather superficial because it had mass conversions of individuals to Christianity. And so it didn't really take hold strongly in this period. It will later on. Scandinavia does develop a very strong Christian presence. Alfred the Great is a key figure for this era. He is a warrior scholar, they call him. He's a brilliant individual. He's also very pious in terms of his understanding of the Lord and seeking the Lord. He writes. I watched I can't remember the name of the series, but it was a serial on that had the Vikings and Alfred and the dynamics of this era, and it showed him forth to be this very pious, wise scholar who was brilliant even in military formation. There was one formation that he had that the Danes were unable to break. They were not used to it, and so he defeated them in battle. And so he was the one who was able to hang on in the midst of all these Viking invasions and maintain control over West Saxony, Wessex. And from there, he began the process of uniting the English people and also incorporating to a certain extent, bringing the Danish into the realm and also bringing about their Christianization. So part of that was Alfred becoming the godfather of Guthrum, a Danish Viking general. If you notice the highlights on these sheets that you have and on my notes on the screen, there's some blue highlights. And for each of these, I've checked them. There's live links, and you can go to various sources to get more information about these individuals or these movements, such as the Vikings, groups such as the Vikings. And so as Alfred began to build these symbiotic relationships, the Vikings are settling in Great Britain. And as part of their deal, they accept Christian baptism and also instruction. And so monks would be sent to work with the Vikings in the various regions where they're settling, and they begin to receive Christian instruction, discipleship, and Christianization is deeper than just the baptism of a group. And so it does become part of their DNA and part of their faith. Another individual here, Formosius, who is Bishop of Rome, he's very concerned that over time the Vikings are not being Christianized well enough. And so he writes a bishop to the, he as the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, sends an irate letter to the English bishop saying, you need to try harder to Christianize these Vikings. And so obviously it's not a once done situation. It's a constant need for discipling and winning them over. And obviously the even the conquest of Great Britain and reclaiming of it for the English people is a successive thing as well. A very important monastic is Dunstan. He's a metalworking saint. He's a very brilliant individual. He's instrumental in reviving Benedictine monasticism. Remember, this goes back to Benedict of Nursia and his rule. And he's also very focused upon development of learning. And he builds up his monastery in Glastonbury, which is a very important historic site. The claim is that Joseph Arimathea was there. He brought the Holy Grail there. It's significant for the legend of King Arthur. And so it's a very important site. And this becomes a very important monastic center. And a little bit later on, Dunstan becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, but his reforms that he brought about and the monasticism that he established there ends up being very, very important. And the cathedral churches, the central churches of each of the dioceses, became very powerful centers of monastic life and learning by his precedent that he set in promoting this in other regions of England. And so Dunstan's very important in this regard. King Ethelwald, he stormed Westminster Cathedral and in 964, and he required the lax clergy there to become Benedictine monks. So he's really trying to pull them. And so what you find going on here is this growth, and monasticism is becoming stronger, and the king is supporting this. And so very soon the cathedrals become Benedictine operations. So they're operating under the Benedictine rule, which involves poverty, chastity, obedience, those features of most monastic life. 973, you have Dunstan crowning King Edgar of all England, which is quite a fascinating thing. This took place in Bath. I have been to Bath. Bath is a beautiful city. It has a lot of stonework that has iron in it, so it sort of has this reddish hue to most of the buildings there. But anyway, Dunstan preached at length on the idea of a Christian king. And so he's promoting the royal kingship. And there's a sense in which the king is sort of like a shepherd of God's people. And the linkage between church and state here is very strong. And the idea that the Archbishop of Canterbury crowns the king and gives him his authority is sort of this church state in conflict here, right? And in this event in 973 marks the earliest surviving English coronation service that you can go back and look at as far as a document. The year 1000, I just want to emphasize, was a time that was very interesting in the whole history of Christianity. Even our setting up of our time, our chronological table of time is an artificial construct. But when the year 1000 was being approached and arrived, it was like the year 2000 was in the last couple decades ago. It was anticipated to be apocalyptic, and there was a lot of concerns, a lot of fears, a lot of speculation regarding it, and so it's kind of an interesting feature. But it's also attended it, not necessarily related to the year 1000, but the Vikings did have some renewal of invasions and conquests, and I'm sure some of that played into even some of the apocalyptic concerns about judgment and warfare and battles and pestilence and all these types of things. And the unusual part of their conquest was in south of England. They had major dominance in north of England, but here they were attacking the south of England as well. Sorry about that. I'm moving my screen here. I'll do it with my arrow on the side so it isn't quite so abrupt. Coming to the year 1012, you have an individual by the name of Alphege. He is an individual who is a monk, a missionary, and he ends up being a mediator and a missionary to the Viking people. A little bit later on, he becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was taken captive by the Vikings. They held him for ransom, and they liked him. They allowed him to preach while they were partying. But in one special circumstance, while they were partying, they brought him out, and he ended up being killed or martyred. And so this became a very significant event in terms of the Vikings' relationship with the English. And later, Knut, C-N-U-T, Danish King of England, he moved his body from London to Canterbury, and so he's a very important figure, and his death marked a significant change of relationship. There are several Wulfstan individuals who are very important in this time period, and I think there are 3 total who they can be very easily confused because it's almost in the same particular time period. But this one from 1014, he's a saint, he's a bishop of London, he was later Bishop of Worcester, and then became, even later than that, Archbishop of York. And he repeats Gildas's condemnation of his countrymen in a famous sermon and calling for their conversion, for their seriousness about the Christianity, and so he's an important figure. 1060, I want to highlight for you King Edward the Confessor. He's basically important because he's the last Saxon king to rule England before William the Conqueror conquers in 1066. And he is called the Confessor. He dies a confessor. A martyr is somebody who dies for their faith. A confessor is someone who suffers for their faith without dying for it. And so that's the difference between a martyr and a confessor. And he has a strong reputation as a saint. And this was promoted actually by William the Conqueror himself to promote his own political reasons when he ultimately conquers Great Britain. In 1062, I have another Wulfstan the First here, and very important, noted for his opposition to slavery, and became Bishop of Worcester. 1066 is a very important event in English history. It's the Norman conquest. Normandy is in northern France, and William had the right to the throne. Actually, Edward, I think, indicated that he would be his successor, and William decides to attack England, and there was another claimant to the throne as well, Harold, I believe it is, and he became, as he conquered and won the Battle of Hastings, he became King William I of England. And he did a lot of things that were very significant. He really considered his conquest of England to be a crusade for the Pope and approved by the Pope to bring the English church into closer relationship with Rome, and it did so for the next 5 centuries, although that relationship was always complex. There was always a sense of independence among the English-speaking people regarding their outside control and even over the church. And so he does promote this, but it's also a little bit complicated. And some of the other things that he did, he redistributed the land, and basically all of the Anglo-Saxon elite were replaced by Norman elite. And this linked England and France for centuries and kept them in close, their family, their elite, their aristocracies close together. And he also, in his reforming of the church, a lot of the Anglo-Saxon churches were accidentally burned, and you have some new churches, some Norman churches being established in this time period. A lot of the Anglo-Saxon churches, I think, were wooden, and so some new architecture, new structures, and new authorities within the church were being established. So the Norman conquest is a real important marker of time change in both the politics and the religion of England. The next date I have here is 1070, and this is affiliated with William I, is Lanfranc. He's an Italian lawyer. He became William's Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's a formidable ally as well as an opponent. He rebuilt the Cathedral of Canterbury, and established the primacy of Canterbury over all of England, although we do have a couple other archbishoprics, but the primacy of Canterbury is established. And he also defended the independence of the English Church against Rome. And so he's appointed by Rome. And so you have sort of this tense relationship there. It is a church that's connected to the Roman Church, but it's not going to be dominated by it in all regards. I think the one failure is identified regarding Lanfranc was his failure to enforce clerical celibacy. And this gets established even more so with the monasticism that develops over the next number of years here. 1070 also marks the year that Margaret, who was an English princess, married Malcolm and becomes the Queen of Scotland. And so the linking there of Scotland and England. And she's also a woman of tremendous piety. I'm giving this lecture on November 19th, and a few days ago we honored her her day, commemoration day, and noted for her restoration of the monastery at Iona, and her establishing schools and hospitals and orphanages. And so she's a very important figure for renewal of Christianity in Scotland during her reign with her husband, Malcolm. Malcolm appears in Shakespeare's Macbeth, if you've read that play. 1080, William, in a letter, reminded the Pope that the English king owes him no allegiance. And so there's some tension going on between William and the Pope. And obviously this church-state control relationship, who has power over the other. In 1090, there's an interesting and important letter, a dissertation actually. It's anonymous, coming from Rouen. And it's a long dissertation on the divine right of kings, arguing that the Bishop of Rome has no authority over kings, and the kings have absolute divine authority over their realms. And this is a tension, this church-state relation, this independence of kings. This becomes a struggle all the way through this medieval period. And it goes all the way back. I think I reminded you of course, Constantine would be an important figure in that, but Charlemagne was appointed Holy Roman Emperor by Leo III. And so you have a lot of tension here in this relationship between who grants who authority to do their work. Is it the secular king giving authority to the Pope, to the bishops, or is it the bishops who give authority to the king? How does this work? And this is always a tension. I put a note here about the investor controversies raging at this time, and it's all over Europe. And again, it's this, who has the authority to choose and invest bishops with their authority and give them their signet ring and their staff and the symbols of their authority. One of the most important figures of English church in the late 1000s is Anselm, who becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a papal advocate and appointee. He's very pleasant. He's very otherworldly. He's a saint, and he's a brilliant thinker. He is the one who developed the ontological argument for the existence of God. In Proslogion, that argument is basically that conceiving of a being than which no greater than can be conceived, that being, if he existed, would be greater than that being if he didn't exist, so therefore he must exist, and so God must exist. And I gave you that in a very poor statement, but look that up online and you'll find a very important statement about arguments for the existence of God that were taking place in this time, building on really some of the earlier work of Aquinas as well. He wrote also Cur Deus Homo, which is why did God become a man? He advocated that the incarnation was a response to God's love for a rebellious human race. And so God satisfied the demands of his own wrath in the atonement. And so what you basically have is a defense of the vicarious atonement, that God made a sacrifice and it satisfies his wrath. And this becomes one of probably the strongest, I won't say the earliest, I think Paul presents to us pretty clearly the idea of the atonement was to appease the wrath of God. But as far as developing it in a fully articulated form, what he wrote in Christus Homo ends up being a very important statement of this theology. There were other views of the atonement earlier than this. You have theosis, you have ransom view, you have various other views in earlier periods, but this is an important one. I think it's really rooted in the earliest history. I think there are many atonement theories that are possible to be stated, but they're all, I think, controlled by and and have validity based upon their connection to the death and resurrection of Christ, the gospel. And so to the degree to which those atonement theories move away from the importance of Christ's death for us, then to a certain extent, they may not be what I would consider an atonement theory. And for instance, the moral influence that Jesus died as a moral influence, and really his death really didn't have any saving efficacy. It's just his life did. I think that's somewhat invalid as a theory. But satisfaction theory gets right at the core of the vicarious atonement of Christ. He died in our place for our sins to appease the wrath of God, but God provided his own satisfaction. And that's Anselm's argument. Here's a prayer that he also was a defender of the filioque clause, and so this is having an impact upon the relationship between Eastern and Western Church. And so he has other things that he's writing beyond these as well. I want to offer you the prayer that he has in his preface to the Proslogion, because it's a beautiful prayer, and it hits upon one of his key expressions that he has in his writing. He said, "I acknowledge, Lord, and I give thanks that you have created your image in me, so that I may remember you, think of you, love you. But this image is so obliterated and worn away by wickedness. It is so obscured by the smoke of sins that it cannot do what it was created to do unless you renew and reform it. I am not attempting, O Lord, to penetrate your loftiness, for I cannot begin to match my understanding with it, but a desire in some measure to understand your truth, which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand. For this too I believe, that unless I believe, I shall not understand." And so what he's really presenting here, I think, is a beautiful statement. We believe that basically our belief, our faith, is really a foundation of our epistemology, our sense of knowledge. Reason is not primary. Reason builds upon the foundational truths of the revelation that God has given. So we believe to understand. I think this correlates well with, I think it's Hebrews 11:3, where it says, "By faith we understand that the worlds were created by the word of God." And I think it connects with that very well. So this is Anselm, one of the important thinkers of this time period, and a very important figure in English Christianity. I also put a note just at the end of this, doesn't really relate to Anselm, but although he is a monastic figure, this era was a very important period of monastic revival, of scholarship, and then also the influence not just of Benedictine monasticism, but also Augustinianism has some revival here, Cistercian related to Bernard of Clairvaux, and then some monasteries for women, houses for women. Most monastic groups at the time had houses for women, I think, except for one or two groups did not make that provision. The note at 1154 is just a footnote in some ways. Nicholas Breakspere, he becomes the only English bishop to become bishop at Rome, and so is the only Englishman who has that privilege. And he became Adrian IV. In 1061, we move to a very important figure in the church. Henry II is king, and Thomas Becket becomes his archbishop. They're good friends. Thomas is lowborn. He's not aristocracy. He's a very clean living best friend. And Henry considers him to be someone who would be loyal to him, and he appoints him Archbishop of Canterbury. And this is one day after Thomas was ordained as a priest. So he became Archbishop of Canterbury very quickly after his ordination as a priest. And yet Becket was going through a process of in his own self, even I think in anticipation of this, of considering monasticism and considering his vows. He took them very seriously. And he defended the rights and privileges of the church versus the state. And this was very unexpected by Henry. They were best friends. They thought they would, I think Henry thought that he would be able to use Thomas to achieve his ends in the church. But Becket became, in some ways, an obstacle for him. And in many ways, an obstacle for him. And Henry was frustrated with him. I think at one point he was ill, and he actually made this statement to some effect. There's all kinds of debate about what exactly Henry II said, but he wanted, in some sense, to be rid of his Archbishop of Canterbury. And so 4 of his knights, and they're named, you can look up their history, they gathered together and they made a plot, and they ended up murdering Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. And it's quite a story, a very important event in the history of England. And he was soon canonized by the Pope as a saint and a miracle worker. I just want to read you a very interesting little expression from, I'm going to hold up this book. It's by John R.H. Mormon, and it's the history of the Church of England. And if you read any book on the history of the Church of England, I'm not sure this is required reading for us. It really should be, because it's a good read. He's got a lot of details in here, but he's also a good storyteller. And I find that to be almost like a parallel to Shelley's book on church history. Mormon's book on the history of the Church of England would be a good one for you to read. And it'll give you many more details in a much more coherent manner. But I think what's interesting, I want to read for you is this portion on page 77, 78 of the 3rd edition. And what it shows you is how Becket went through his transition to become this very devoted advocate for the church, even in opposition to his good friend Henry. Talks about his ordination as a priest on June 2nd, 1162, and consecrated archbishop on the following day. Immediately, his whole manner of life changed. He threw aside his old life and adopted the life of an ascetic, living in almost monastic seclusion at Canterbury. To some, this has appeared as hypocrisy, but it was not so, nor was it a sign of sudden conversion. The explanation is that he was one of those men who visualize the part which they are to play and then adapt their lives to the type which they have created in their own minds. As chancellor, Becket had seen himself, as chancellor for the king, as a magnificent courtier, glorious in his apparel, reckless in his hospitality, and that's how he was the king's chancellor. But now, as archbishop, he saw himself as the leading churchman in England, fighting for God and the freedom of his church against tyranny and oppression, and he was able to adapt his life accordingly. And Henry was baffled and infuriated. And I find this to be the case several times in church history, where you have an individual who comes from a secular world, and all of a sudden he's ordained in the church, and he becomes this powerful force and uncompromising force for God, advocating for the church and its position, its strength, and surprises people in terms of how strong their advocacy and their defense is. So that's Thomas Becket. 1176, we have Hugh of Lincoln, was brought by Henry II to England to be abbot of the Carthusian monastery, which is a new monastic movement. Part of this is that Henry was somewhat repentant over the death of Becket. I don't know that he intended for his 4 knights to kill Becket. And I think he had a lot of remorse over the fact that he was killed. And so here's sort of a penance of his. He brings Hugh of Lincoln to establish a new monastic movement there in England itself. And so Henry enjoyed Hugh's plain speech. He would rebuke him. He would say things directly to him. He wasn't someone who beat around the bush. And so he was appointed by Henry II as Bishop of Lincoln in 1186. And he resisted strongly the abuses of King Henry and Richard the Lionhearted, Richard I, toward the church during this period. You hear the name Richard the Lionhearted, realize as well that this is a time period when there were crusades going on, and Richard would be one who would be gathering some of the nobles of Great Britain and taking them on a crusade to the Holy Land, and a disastrous one, particularly. 1205, the Bishop of Rome appoints Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. And what's interesting here is this is appointed by the Bishop of Rome. You can hear the investiture controversy going on here because he wasn't someone who was loyal to King George and King John, excuse me, and King John would not allow him to enter England. And this becomes a major conflict that ultimately ends and leads to the Magna Carta being signed in 1215. Langton is an important individual. He was the producer of the divisions of the books of the Bible into chapters. And so it wasn't until here in the 1200s that chapter divisions of the Bible were established. Then later on verses are established as well. And so a very interesting development in our Bible and how it's shaped and formed. 1208, Pope Innocent III placed England under an interdict. And this is partly due to John's resistance to accept Langton. And interdict is a very interesting, powerful tool. The Pope has a number of tools that he uses to coerce people, particularly during the medieval period. One was crusade, obviously would be coercive to try to win over the pagans. Excommunication was directed toward an individual, where you would forbid them from receiving any of the church's graces through sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. And Pope Innocent did excommunicate John. But what happens when interdict occurs is you place an entire region under a prohibition either one that the sacraments of the church cannot be administered, so it even shuts down the churches so that people are not receiving the grace of God, or it invalidates their efficacy. And so even if someone, a rebellious priest or whatever, might go ahead and offer the sacraments, it has no efficacy. And so Pope Innocent administered the interdict, and this stood for 4 years. And during this time, among the people of England, a very anti-royal and anti-papal sentiment began to develop among the people because of this power struggle. Part of it is that. Sort of a factor on the continent, but it's going to have impact in Great Britain, is that in 1210, you have in Italy an event going on with John Francisco Frenchi Bernardone, who also is known as Francis of Assisi, became known as that. He's an Italian. He obtained from the Bishop of Rome support for his group of young friars or little brothers who become the First Order Franciscans. And so they're devoting themselves to celibacy, to obedience, to poverty, and they are sort of circuit riding preachers. The notes here have the statement, they're sort of like Wesley's circuit riding preachers during the Great Awakening. It's more so maybe Wesley's circuit riding preachers are following their example. But it's sort of this trend of people who go about and preach the word of God and preach to people, even sometimes outside in the street, in the open air. And it becomes that type of a movement. And the Dominicans, also are friar preachers, founded by Dominic in Spain, did the same thing. They did this also in France. And so you have these developments going on of friars a new type of monasticism that's not just gone away to set aside to pray, to do the orders and things of that nature, devoting themselves to learning. They're also individuals who are out preaching. And eventually, both these orders evolve into, I think, orders that really promoted education, discipleship, and trying to lead to a more instructed clergy. And so both the Franciscans and Dominicans end up having universities and things of that nature as they develop over time. 1212, you have King John II resigned. And here's a significant element here. After 4 years under interdict and 3 years of being excommunicated, John II resigned his kingship to the Bishop of Rome and received it back as a holding from the Roman legate. And so what he's doing by this action, he's essentially saying that the Bishop of Rome has the right to vest the King of England with his authority to rule. And this ended the interdict, but Parliament finds this as a tremendous compromise. And they declared John's resignation of the crown as illegal. And what many of the English people, the common people, particularly the people who aren't really strong church people, noticed was that, hey, 4 years we're into the interdict, and nothing really bad happened to them. And so what does this interdict do? Does it really hurt us that badly? And their answer essentially was no. That's 1212. 1212 also, Francis and his friend Clare, they found the Second Order Franciscans of cloistered nuns, and also known as the Minoresses or Poor Clares. They devote themselves to prayer and acts of mercy, medical, serving the poor, and feeding the poor, and various activities of that nature. Obviously, devoting themselves to prayer and seeking God for and advocacy with God for people is crucial to their identity. 1215 ends up being a very important year. It's kind of interesting when you see a year that has a confluence of several factors. But one is, the first one here is King John is forced to sign the Magna Carta. Now, John is pretty humble by this point, I would think, because number one, he had to submit himself to the Pope in 1212, and now the Parliament and the aristocracy of England force him, and Langdon as well, who's Archbishop of Canterbury, force him to sign the Great Charter. And it provides protection of church rights and protected the barons from illegal imprisonment. It gave access to swift justice, and it limited feudal payments to the crown, so he couldn't tax. It limited his taxation. And its influence was there for a period, but it waned quickly. But it became, I think, even more important later at the time of the Reformation. It's something we still look back to as something that's very important for the formation of democracy and representative government and things of that nature, and limiting the divine right of kings and the absolute power of monarchy. And so this is an important political marker, but it also is connected to the church here in 1215 for protecting the church as well as being drafted by the Archbishop. 1215, you also have one of the most important councils of the church, particularly the medieval church, with the Fourth Lateran Council. And it was led by Innocent III, attended by a host of primates and I say primates, I would say even the Patriarch of Jerusalem and Constantinople, various bishops and priests. So it was very ecumenical beyond Roman Catholicism itself. And there were bishops there from England, so they're represented as well. And transubstantiation became official church doctrine, the Roman doctrine of the Eucharist, where the body and blood of Christ, the wine and the host become the actual body and blood of Christ by Roman doctrine. It called for the primacy of Rome, although I'm sure the primates of the Eastern Orthodox Church probably did not buy into that. I know they didn't. It defended annual confession, auricular confession, oral confession, and established procedures and penalties for heresies, and actually probably was the impetus behind some of the inquisitions that would follow in the next couple centuries. 1221, you have the Dominicans who started off in France, moving into England. And these mendicant begging orders reformed education discipleship, as I stated a moment ago. 1221, you have the third order Franciscans. So the first order would be the monks, second order would be the nuns, third order would be for lay persons who would have become friars but had a family or a career. And so it becomes an order for individuals who are just very dedicated lay persons to enter into some pledged order that they would really devote themselves to God. And all three of these Franciscan orders are active in the Anglican Church today. And so realize that this is something that took hold and is still present in the contemporary time period. 1224, you have the first order Franciscans reach England. And so now they're going to have a major impact in England, following 3 years after the Dominicans reach England. And since the regular clergy seldom or never preach, friars were important for promoting and building the life of local churches. And it's kind of interesting. There was one of the things the Reformation did, and really Wycliffe was promoting this. A lot of the priests were not well trained. Some of them were even illiterate. And so the promotion of education among the clergy was crucial. And some of the universities promoted this, but it also became required right before the Reformation and into the Reformation. And part of the reason why the Anglican Church had sermons that our whole bank of sermons that are available for Anglican clergy to preach was because they wanted to make sure that they were able to communicate rightly the doctrines of the faith and to just promote preaching. And I'm sure that probably at that time, many of the priests just read those sermons that had been prepared, the homilies, the Anglican homilies. And you can learn about that. Just look them up. I'm not sure the exact number, but there's a whole bank of homilies that are useful. And I think would be worthy for you to read and be aware of their presence in some of the topics, justification by faith, all kinds of different topics that they address. I've got a little bit out of order here. 1220, I have the Salisbury Cathedral begun, the order of service here. And this is a very important cathedral in Great Britain. Its style, its beauty is amazing. It becomes a model. And it also, the order of service there ended up being a model for Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. And so this is an important cathedral in English Christianity. 1250, last few people here are very important scholars, and sort of gives you a feel for some of the intellectual development and influence of the English-speaking church. Robert Grosseteste, he's a very poor boy, coming from a poor background, becomes a scholar and a scientist. He becomes the Chancellor of Oxford. Oxford University has been established in the last 100 years or so, and he also becomes Bishop of Lincoln. He was very strong to promote reform among the clergy. He prevented papal and royal abuses of the Church of England, and so he's a very strong advocate here. He was never canonized as a saint, but his name is repeated by the Bird's Call, Bob O'Link, Robert of Lincoln. And so I think that's a play on words that becomes a sort of a joke in Britain. Richard is a poor boy who also became a scholar. He was elected Bishop of Chichester against the wishes of King Henry III. Here's a conflict here of who has the power to ordain again. And I would imagine what happened here is that the Archbishop of Canterbury ordained him to his role against Henry's wishes. He wasn't loyal to Henry. And so what does Henry do? Henry locks him out of his episcopal house. And Robert and Grosseteste and Richard oppose Henry's abuses of clerical appointments. One of the things that would happen here at times so that kings could raise money, they would retain a vacancy and a clerical vacancy, say a bishop or a priest, and the money that came in to support that bishop or priest, since it wasn't being used for that bishop or priest, began to fuel the coffers of the king. And so they would keep these vacancies open for long periods of time because it just increased their own personal revenues that they could use. And so Richard and Robert opposed this practice of clerical appointments, saying, make your appointments, get people in those roles so that the church can flourish, and don't just keep scraping money out of the coffers of the church. You can see a whole lot of conflict going on in this period related to these types of things. 1269, you have the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, begun by Henry III. And this is the era of the Gothic cathedrals. Westminster Abbey, I think, has been rebuilt even another time since this time, but it was very important developments. And this is the high time of universities and cathedrals being just glorious architecture and places of celebration, centers for learning and worship. 1255, you have Roger Bacon, student of Grosseteste, inventor of the telescope, microscope, and thermometer. And here he is, this brilliant scientist, and he's a Franciscan. He's a monk. And so you can see how the church is really taking upon itself a lot of responsibility, a lot of influence in education, intellectual developments, but also and also scientific discoveries. And so maybe fueling. I know one of the books that very much impacted me. I lament in the contemporary time frame the warfare that I see between the Christian faith and science, and I find that it's very counterproductive. And a lot of times the skepticism, I think it really generated a lot, perhaps during the time of evolution in the 1800s and into the 1900s, where Christians began to just ignore and mock scientific scholars. But Nancy Percy, I think her last name was, she wrote a book called The Soul of Science. And her idea was, in that book, was that in no other place than in Christian medieval world did the scientific revolution take place. And why did it take place there? Because the scientists, who were themselves churchmen, had deep beliefs and faith in God, believing that all of the creation would bring glory to God, and whatever they discovered through the creation would be harmonious with the truth of God in God's word, and would all redound to the glory of God. And so science really had its root, its foundation, and its modern development in rich ecclesiology, rich church belief, and trust that whatever we discover, let's look at the universe through the microscope. Let's learn more about the solar system and all these types. To them, it was just bringing glory to God. Now, the church became a resistor to that with Galileo and other things of that nature. But we don't seem to regain our footing again to be individuals who believe very, very significantly in our hearts. Obviously, there's interpretation that needs to go on. How do you interpret data? But I find that the church's opposition to science, climate science, and all these other things is not necessarily helping us in terms of our image in the public square. And our recanting of some of our opposition decades later doesn't necessarily help the fact that we were obstructionists at various points. And so Roger Bacon and obviously many of the others who are important scientists of this era remind us of the fact that the scientific movement really generated out of Christian monasticism and deeply committed Christian scientists. The last item on our time frame before we get to the 100 Years' War, 1324, I just want to raise up for you William of Ockham. He's an English Franciscan friar. He's a very important philosopher, and he created a philosophy that went against Aquinas and some of the others as far as their teaching. And he developed a philosophy that was very much attacked. And he had to answer for his philosophical views at the papal court of Avignon. He espoused what he believed was what he would call fideism, stating that only faith gives us access to theological truth. The ways of God are not open to reason, for God has freely chosen to create a world and establish a way of salvation within it. apart from any necessary laws that human logic or rationality can uncover. He was really against a lot of the scholasticism that was going on and the scrutinization of what's going on in the Eucharist and all these types of things. And he said, stop that. He said, it's foolishness. And his nominalism dominated European thought until the Reformation. And so you sort of have a movement away of some of those really intense scholastic arguments about how many angels can sit on the head of a pin, things of that nature. And so he would say, God tells us his revelation, and by faith we receive it. These theological truths do not need logic to support them. We don't have to do an analysis upon the substance of wine and bread to determine how exactly it becomes the body and blood. If Jesus said, this is my body, it involves, and this is my blood, then it involves a spiritual, mystical thing that isn't necessarily a rational, something that can be subjected to rational thought. His quest for simplicity was very much a foundation to his own thought, and he's well known for Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation for a problem is typically the best explanation for that problem. And so that's his view. So this is our middle medieval period. A lot of ground covered there, but it gives you a feel for how important monasticism was, even how important monasticism was even for intellectual development in this time period. So science and education and the establishment of universities all over Europe, but obviously Oxford and Cambridge were established in this time period, and the great cathedrals, and still conflict between church and state and kings and archbishops and popes. The seeds are here for what's going to happen with the Reformation. These struggles will be ongoing, and we'll see them unfold more in the higher Middle Ages. Okay, so God bless you. Thanks for your attention, and hope some of these themes are resonating with you as you hear some of these important names and movements and trends in this era. God bless you.